Hi, my name's Carol Kaminsky, and welcome to this Casket Empty Bible series, where we're really looking at the story of the Bible and tracing the theme of redemption, and especially looking to see how it climaxes in the coming of the Messiah. Well, we're in the second section called Abraham, and this is the A from the letter in the casket acronym. The story of Abraham really begins in about 2000 BC. And this is the story where God is going to call Abraham and make promises to him. And so we're looking at Genesis 12 to 50 is where we find about these characters, about Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau, as well as Israel. And then Israel is going to have 12 sons that become the sons of Israel. So that's where we're headed with the call of Abraham. As we look at the call of Abraham, you might be wondering, well, how is it that Abraham ever finds out about who the Lord God is? You see, Abraham grew up in a town called in southern Mesopotamia. Now, this town, excavations have been done, and it had a huge ziggurat, which is, and you may not be familiar with this term, but it is a word that is used to describe an ancient temple that had steps up it. So this city had a ziggurat right in the center that was dedicated to the moon god Sin. So this is where Abraham grew up, and his father Terah and his family. Not only was this the town that he grew up in, but he was 75 years old before he left Earth. So he grew up there in most of his adult life. We find out from another passage in the Old Testament, in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2, where it says, Terah, which is Abraham's father, and his family worshipped idols. Now, we don't hear about this very often, but what it reminds us is that when God came to Abraham, he wasn't a good man and he wasn't a righteous man, but in fact, he was from an idol-worshipping family. Well, how is it that he ever finds out about who the Lord God is? What we learn from the story of Abraham is that God makes promises to him, and God makes promises that are recorded in Genesis 12, 1 to 3. And God says to him that he is to leave his hometown, he's to leave his country, he's to leave his family of origin, and he's going to go to a place that the Lord is going to show him. And so the story is picked up in and we find out that God himself actually turns up in the city of to make these promises to Abraham. This reminds us from the beginning of the story that this God of Genesis 1 to 11 wants to be in relationship with human beings, and he initiates that relationship. And so how does Abraham respond? We find out that Terah and Abraham and the extended family leave and they're going to go to a northern city in Haran where Terah is going to remain. And then Abraham with his wife is going to leave and go to the promised land that God is going to show to him. So from the beginning of the story, we see that God is the one who is initiating a relationship with Abraham. He's not choosing a good person or a righteous person. It is God's choice. He's choosing to reveal himself to Abraham. And Abraham responds in faith to God. And so he ends up in the promised land where he builds an altar to the Lord God. Well, God makes promises to Abraham, and one of the promises is you're going to have so many descendants, you can't even count them. And what's fascinating about this story is that at the beginning of the story, we're told that his wife, Sarah, who is also elderly, Abraham is 75, Sarah is 65 years old. We're told that Sarah was barren, she had no child. Could you imagine that? Here we have God promising Abraham, you're going to have so many children, you can't even count them. And yet here he has a barren wife who is unable to give birth to children. What this is going to remind us of is the promises God makes to Abraham are going to be fulfilled by God himself. He is the one that is going to enable Sarah to give birth to Isaac. And this actually is going to then define who are the children of Abraham, because the children of Abraham are going to be defined not simply biological, but by promise. And we're going to see that those children are those who respond by faith and follow the steps of Abraham to have faith in God. Well, God makes these promises of many descendants. He also says to Abraham that I am going to be your God, and you and your seed are going to be my people. So we have a relationship. Even though he grew up in a place that worshiped many gods, God is revealing himself that he's going to enter into a relationship with Abraham. We find God's going to give him land, the promised land, a new place to inhabit. God also promises his presence. He says, I will be with you. This is an answer to what happened in Genesis 1-11. If you remember that in the story of the fall in Genesis chapter 3, human beings are banished from God's presence. Sin causes a separation from presence because God is a holy God. But here, there's going to be a restoration because God says, I will be with you. God's presence with him. God also promises Abraham that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed in you and in your seed or in your descendants. God also promises Abraham, you're going to be the father of many nations. Well, why is this important when we think of the early story of the Old Testament? Sometimes I find people think that the story of the Bible is an exclusive story for Israel only, for the Jewish people. And this is really not the case. Because when God makes promises to Abraham, we are in chapter 12 of Genesis, right at the beginning. His purpose in blessing Abraham was so that Abraham would be a blessing to the nations. And what that means is that there is the expectation in the promise that through Abraham and his seed, all the nations of the earth would come to know the living God. And in fact, as we trace the story of this in the Old Testament, we're going to find that it is ultimately fulfilled in the coming of the Messiah, who is the seed of Abraham. And that's why actually in the early church, in the New Testament, you start to see a lot of the nations becoming part of the people of God. This is in fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham. And there are already hints of this in the story of the Old Testament. For example, when they come out of Egypt, they come out a great multitude. We're going to see when we come to King David, an important king, that there are people from all nations that are being incorporated into his family. So this is a great promise. God also promises Abraham that kings are going to come forth from you. This means that God is planning from the very beginning that there would be a king reigning over the people of God. This promise is going to be fulfilled through Israel's fourth-born son, Judah. So these are great blessings, and they are not based on Abraham's obedience, but on God's promise to fulfill it. We come to the story in Genesis chapter 15, and Abraham at this point is worried, well, I haven't got a child yet, so what are you going to do, God? And God takes him outside and he says, look at the stars and see if you can count them. And we read that Abraham believed God, and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. What that simply means is that God looks at Abraham's faith in him and he counts it as though it was a righteous act. So it's a legal law court setting to say that Abraham is in the right. Even though he is a sinner, he is being declared to be in the right because he trusts in God. And that verse is important for the whole Bible because it's going to be the way for people who are not from the biological descendants. How can they become part of the people of God? It is by following the steps of Abraham and having faith. Abraham at this point believes that God can fulfill his promise. He's got a wife who's unable to have children. He believes that God can fulfill the promise. And how does he know this? Because he believes that God can bring life out of that which is dead. Because he looks at his own body as good as dead, and he looks at Sarah's womb and he says, God, you are the creator God. You can do it. And so that's why he becomes the father of both the Jew and the Gentile. He's the father of many nations. And we call this in the Bible justification. It means that God declares Abraham to be in the right, and it is God's gift of his grace. We then have the story of Genesis chapter 16. We have the birth of Ishmael, and we have circumcision that takes place, a sign of the covenant, in chapter 17. And then we have the story of the birth of Isaac in chapter 18, when God promises this lady who's elderly, who can't have children, that she's going to have a son, and therefore the children are defined as children of promise. This means in the bigger picture of the story that God has a plan for a multi-ethnic people of God, and those people are incorporated into this family through faith ultimately in Jesus Christ. The story then, you may be familiar with this, in chapter 22, where God tests Abraham's faith to say, are you willing to believe in me and to trust in me even before family members? Because in chapter 21, we find Abraham is going to send out Ishmael in fulfillment of what God has said. God's going to care for Hagar. He's going to care for Ishmael. They're going to become a great nation. There's promises given. But Abraham has got to put God first. He does this with Isaac, where he's willing to offer up Isaac, but God steps in at the last moment because God ultimately is going to provide his own son to provide for the sin of the world. So these promises that are being made to Abraham form the foundation for the whole storyline of the Bible. And so we've spent some extra time on them because they're very important. And as we come to certain sections of the story, I will probably refer back to these promises. This covenant that God makes with Abraham, and then it's going to be continued with Isaac, and then through the whole storyline of Israel. This covenant is ultimately going to be fulfilled as people from all nations are going to be incorporated into the people of God. So the storyline finishes with there being a famine, and Joseph is going to be in Egypt, and God raises him up to provide for his people. Through this famine, we also start to see that once Joseph dies, there's a new Pharaoh. They're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years, which God has already said would take place. But what's interesting is while they are in Egypt, God hasn't forgotten about his people. In fact, it is the time when God is fulfilling his promises that he gave right at creation, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, because the Israelites are multiplying. And this is then going to set the context for our next section, which we've called Sinai, which takes up the story of God's people, and especially under the leadership of Moses. So I hope you'll join us for the next section as we see how this story continues.